The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany. After the end of the Second World War, trials are held inside this building. Almost 200 defendants are held responsible for 12 years of dictatorship, waging wars of aggression and mass murder. The International Military Tribunal is the centerpiece, the first of its kind on legally and morally uncharted territory. On November the 20th, 1945, 20 surviving leaders of Hitler's Third Reich are transported by elevator directly from the prison block into the courtroom. Hermann Goering, Hitler's designated successor, is the highest-ranking defendant, the face of Nazism.
Goering said, everybody knows this whole trial is not a trial. This is just an arrangement where the victors will take revenge on the defeated.
The tribunal charges fanatical ideologists and unscrupulous ministers, infamous propagandists and merciless generals.
The defendants never showed the slightest remorse. It was part of their stolz, their pride, to insist that they were right all the time and would do it again.
The American chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, is determined to convict these men as living symbols of racial hatred, terrorism, and violence, and of the cruelty of power.
My father saw it as a possibility to make a contribution to international law, and thereby perhaps to international peace.
Convictions were by no means certain. You must put no man on trial, Justice Jackson has warned, if you are not willing to see him freed if not proved guilty. In the Nuremberg courtroom, before the eyes of the world, the victorious Allies attempt to stay the hand of vengeance and follow a difficult and uncertain path to justice.
Against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility that four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
Wollen wir in diesem Kampf etwas zustoßen, dann ist mein erster Nachfolger Marcellus Stern.
Der Führer hat uns wieder wehrhaft gemacht, weil sein Volk liebt und ihm die Sicherung Deutschlands am Herzen liegt.
You must plead guilty or not guilty. Bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig.
Attention! Tribunal.
In the courtroom flooded by lights for the newsreel cameras, hundreds of spectators and 20 defendants wait for the unprecedented trial to begin. As the 8 judges take their places on the bench, the air is thick with anticipation.
At the very opening of the trial, when the indictment was read and each defendant was called upon to plead to it, plead guilty, not guilty, or guilty with an explanation. The tribunal called on Goering as the first defendant, and he stood up with a piece of paper in his hand and said, "Before I respond to the indictment, I wish to say the following.
Bevor ich die Frage des Gerichtshofes beantworte,
Before I answer the question of the court whether I plead guilty or not guilty,"
the tribunal cut him short and said, "You are here to plead guilty, not guilty, or guilty with an explanation." And with that remonstrance, he shouted, "Nicht schuldig."
bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage
Responding to
nicht
the
schuldig.
indictment, I plead not guilty.
That was an indication of his ability to try to find an opening to present what he wanted to say rather than what he was being asked.
Each defendant pleads not guilty. Robert Jackson now takes the podium. He has labored over his opening statement for weeks.
May I please the tribunal?
The world now is to learn about the why of Nuremberg.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated.
That set the tone, not only for the speech which followed, but for the entire trial. This was not a trial of Germans alone. This was a trial for humanity. This was a trial to prevent tyranny from raising its head again in any place in the world.
The trial unfolding in Nuremberg is not without controversy. In the summer of 1944, American President Franklin Roosevelt has asked government officials to work out strategies to bring Nazi war criminals to justice. Voices calling for vengeance have been numerous and forceful. Roosevelt's influential Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, argues for summary executions. Colonel Murray Bernays, a young lawyer in the War Department, has developed a plan to try the Nazi leaders, just like an organized crime syndicate. The atrocities were not single or unconnected, says Bernays, but were the inevitable outcome of the basic criminal conspiracy of the Nazi Party.
That was the concept, that we would charge these leading defendants with conspiring, getting together and plotting to seize control of the German government and subjecting the German people to its dictatorial control, making the German people themselves victims and eliminating freedom in Germany, eliminating democracy, establishing a ruthless dictatorship. And then, having done that, that's the conspiracy, then committing the crimes that they did in the name of the German people.
For months, the Allies disagree. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin wants show trials, followed quickly by executions. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill favors swift executions of top Nazi leaders. But President Roosevelt has decided to promote the Bernays plan for a trial.
It was difficult for the political figures to come to the view that after this rather brutal, long-out war, that something as refined and patient as a legal process should be pursued. But it would have violated at least the best versions of American law and British law to have summary execution.
Roosevelt's trial plans encounter resistance at the Supreme Court in Washington. Even the Chief Justice fears a high-grade lynching. The world yields no respect to courts that are merely organized to convict, says Associate Justice Robert Jackson. If we want to shoot Germans as a matter of policy, he recently warned in a speech, let it be done as such, but don't hide the deed behind a court. But soon the former Attorney General is drawn to the challenge. Shortly after Roosevelt's death, Jackson accepts an offer from the new president, Harry Truman, to become the chief U.S. counsel for the prosecution of Nazi war criminals. As the war rushes to its conclusion, Jackson quickly learns about the atrocities discovered in the concentration camps. Special war crimes investigators accompany the troops, arrest suspects, and secure evidence.
And my mind just refused to grasp what my eyes saw. I was coming in there to prove the crimes, and these people who were lying in the dirt Mostly you couldn't tell if they were dead or alive. If they stirred, it was unusual. These were objects, and you cannot look upon them as human beings. They didn't look like human beings, many of them.
The investigators discover the unimaginable extent of Nazi atrocities. News of extermination camps and the murder of 6 million Jews spread across the United States as Jackson prepares his case.
He was approached by representatives of the Jewish community, and they very specifically wanted this to be a trial of what we call as the Holocaust. And he was quite dismissive and said that would not be a good idea. This has to be about humanity, not about the Jews. So in fact, the treatment of the specific details of mass execution and the final solution was relegated to simply one small portion of the trial.
As horrible as the Holocaust was, Jackson sees it as a byproduct of the chief crime of the Nazis, waging wars of aggression. But according to international law, this has never been punished.
War making was not illegal. You were justified in making war. And Jackson felt that this was wrong and that the time had come for the law to take a step forward. This was the right time and the right place for people to express the idea, which was fundamental to Jackson, that war making itself is the supreme international crime. And aggressive war should be condemned as a crime.
Convinced that we have an opportunity to bring to a just judgment those who have thought it safe to wage aggressive and ruthless war.
In the final hours of the war, Adolf Hitler and his propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels commit suicide. The organizer of genocide, Heinrich Himmler, too escapes criminal prosecution by biting on a potassium cyanide capsule. As the Allies round up potential defendants, Jackson soon realizes that it will be no easy task to prosecute them.
He finds out that there's no case ready to go and that there's really not very much evidence connected to individuals. I mean, it's one thing to have a general sense of atrocities and misconduct at the governmental level, but a prosecutor needs individual specific items of evidence, witnesses, documents, etc., to go forward into court.
In early May, Jackson learns that Hermann Goering has surrendered to American troops in Austria, bringing truckloads of personal belongings with him. Goering believes that the Allies would accept him as negotiator. Jackson thinks otherwise. Now the highest-ranking surviving Nazi could be put on trial.
Justice Jackson made the decision that he would attempt to prove through this major defendant, Hermann Goering, just how a dictatorship comes into being. We conceived this idea. What happens when somebody gets control of a country and then goes into criminality? How does this happen?
Hermann Goering, one of the most conspicuous and notorious figures in Nazi Germany, will be Jackson's defendant number one. Goering's career begins in 1916 above the battlefields of the First World War. Bloody and unyielding trench warfare has dragged on for 2 years. A new type of weapon changes the face of the war: fighter planes. Pilots on both sides become idols, and their spectacular dogfights are legendary. The fledgling Imperial Air Service casts a spell on the young Prussian officer Hermann Goering. He proves an audacious daredevil and is credited with downing 22 enemy aircraft. In 1918, Captain Goering receives the highest decoration of the Empire, the medal Pour le Mérite. He takes over the famous squadron of the Red Baron, who's been killed in a dogfight. But the war is soon over. The squadron is dissolved. The end of his army career plunges Goering into a deep crisis. After fleeting contacts with paramilitary groups, he leaves Germany and moves to Scandinavia. The 25-year-old officer refuses to accept the downfall of the monarchy and despises the harsh conditions of the victors for peace. Our time will come again, he vows. Rockelstad Castle near Stockholm becomes something of a second home to him. The estate belongs to the Swedish adventurer Count Erik von Rosen. He is an explorer who travels the world. His love for Nordic sagas deeply impresses his new friends from Germany. In order to earn a living in Sweden, Goering enters service as a mail pilot. Newsreel footage shows him at work. Sometimes he carries passengers too. One day, he flew Count von Rosen to Rockelstad. Von Rosen is a millionaire who lives out his chivalrous fantasies in the romantic castle. And for Goering, the place holds a particular attraction. On his very first visit to Rockelstad, he set eyes on his host's sister-in-law. She appeared on the staircase like a Nordic-Germanic goddess, he remembers later. Goering falls so madly in love with her that he feels he's been struck by lightning. Karin von Kansau is married to a Swedish member of the aristocracy, but she soon responds to the passionate advances of the German pilot.
Hat sie wirklich geliebt. Ich glaube, dass Hermann Göring imponiert war von der schwedischen Frau. Sie war selbstständig.
He was truly in love with her. I think Hermann Göring was impressed by this Swedish woman. She was independent and spoke her mind. She didn't shy away from male conversations. I think that was part of the attraction. It developed gradually. The political discussions meant a lot to them.
Though she has a husband and son, Karin gets a divorce, marries her lover, and follows him to Germany. She shares Goering's nationalistic views as he totally devotes himself to the radical ideas of Adolf Hitler. And Hitler can really use a war hero. Goering is assigned the task of leading a paramilitary organization. In 1923, he and his stormtroopers take part in a march which features World War I veterans. As so-called patriotic combat divisions, they are united in order to bring down the young German Republic by force. The early Nazis have their base in Munich, and together with other radicals, Hitler wages a coup d'etat against the despised Republic. On November the 9th, 1923, demonstrators approach the city center, with Hitler and Goering marching in the first row. Rivals, however, have sold them out to the government. The coup collapses when the police open fire. Badly wounded, Goering escapes to Austria, where doctors give him morphine to ease the pain. Hitler is behind bars and the Nazi Party banned. The Goerings are wanted in Germany, so Hermann and his wife return to Sweden. Goering soon gets addicted to morphine and is admitted to Langbro Mental Hospital in 1925. Eventually, he's put in a straitjacket. His medical file characterizes him as fervently anti-Semitic and a brutal hysteric, with a weak character, malicious to others, but sentimental where his own family is concerned. Goering checks himself out of the hospital after a few weeks, but the addiction remains with him until 1945. Following an amnesty, he is allowed to return to Germany in 1927. Once there, Goering immediately joins the Nazi Party, which Hitler has reformed after his release from prison. In his immediate entourage, Hitler is able to make use of the sophisticated, well-mannered man. He has decided to fight the Republic from within and selects Goering to run for parliament in Berlin. Berlin party chief Joseph Goebbels watches Goering's career with suspicion. He is a morphine addict, Goebbels notes. He does the craziest things. Sometimes he thinks he is Chancellor, at other times Minister of Defense. We have a classic case of megalomania. He urgently requires treatment.
Wie die meisten, die Macht bekommen, war ein gefährlicher Mensch. Konnte natürlich total rücksichtslos sein.
Like most people who suddenly come to power, he was dangerous. He could be totally ruthless in the face of imagined enemies. On the other hand, he could be kind when you defended someone and try to show him that person in a positive light.
Für Menschen eintrat und bat und versuchte, die andere Seite dieses Menschen zu zeigen.
In October 1931, Karin Goering dies of a heart disease. At first, her widower seems inconsolable. But soon, Goering devotes himself to his political career. He uses his excellent connections within influential circles to aid Hitler in his rise to power. When the Nazis win the general election in 1932, Goering becomes president of parliament. His opinion now carries weight with many politicians. Within just a few months, Goering wins the support of senior army officers and the conservative elite. After tough negotiations, Hitler is appointed Chancellor. It is Goering's luckiest hour, comments his rival Goebbels. On January the 30th, 1933, Hitler presents his cabinet to the press, with Hermann Goering as a member. Goering has reached his foremost goal, to bring Hitler into power. They are determined to transform Germany into a dictatorship. 12 years later, after a brutal and bloody war is lost and more than 50 million people are dead, Goering will be the highest-ranking surviving Nazi to stand trial in Nuremberg. When the Allies take him into custody in May 1945, Hermann Goering still wears his silver-grey uniform with expensive jewelry and high military decorations attached. Goering believes that the victors will not be able to govern Germany without him. Some of his former enemies seem to agree and treat him as an equal. American officers even throw a party for him. They toast bravery and daring to the heavens. War is like a football game, Goering says. Whoever loses shakes his opponent by the hand, and everything is forgotten. Journalists are permitted to interview him. He gives the impression of a great man who has suffered misfortune, one reporter writes, and is now trying to extricate himself from the situation using his charm and wiles. Robert Jackson is annoyed when he hears about the lenient treatment for his principal defendant.
People like Goering were in custody of the army. They're in Europe. Jackson's very small staff is still in Washington. Evidence gathering needed to be done, but he hadn't even begun the process. So he at least wants the reporters out of the job and people like Goering buttoned up until, in due course, Jackson and his team can get there.
At the American chief prosecutor's request, Goering is finally treated like a common criminal. To put Goering and others on trial, Jackson needs to collect hard evidence to connect them to specific crimes. He is looking for signed orders or other incriminating documents. Jackson sends search teams into occupied Germany, who soon discover what they're looking for. The Germans have meticulously recorded all the details of their crimes and did not have enough time to destroy everything at the end of the war.
I'd visited many Gestapo offices, and I found documents lying around on the floor saying this man should be executed. I picked them up off the floor. There were many, many documents that were not destroyed that we obtained and were incriminating.
Most Germans claim to be unaware of the hideous crimes committed by their government. War crimes investigators rarely find eyewitnesses to Nazi atrocities who are prepared to testify.
I did interviewing, and very often I was used for translating documents, and suddenly the door opened and in walks a man, and he looks gray, he looked was small, maybe 5'6" or 7", and dirty, and he was unusually distraught.
Hermann Graeber once ran a factory in occupied Ukraine using Jewish slave labor. One morning, the Jews didn't show up for work. Graeber tells the investigator what he saw when he went looking for them in the Jewish ghetto.
Then he stood there, and there began a tragic procession of people, men, women, children. They all came, and in groups of 20, they were there undressed. They were examined, for example, if they had still gold teeth. So this all was put in buckets, and once they were totally naked, they were pushed down the stairs, and when they reached the bottom of the stairs, there were standing people with machine pistols and shot them down.
After concluding his preparations in Washington, the American chief prosecutor flies to Europe. His mission is extremely difficult. His talks with the Allies at London's Church House soon bogged down. The Soviets want speedy trials with prosecutors simply outlining charges and judges handing down sentences. Jackson insists there should be time for the accused to defend themselves, and that judges be free to determine guilt or innocence. The British and the French think that under existing laws, the German war crimes are punishable anyway. The Soviets resent Jackson's vision of a new international criminal law.
The Soviets took the view that a war of aggression was an international crime when committed by the Nazis. My father took the view that there was no such crime known, that a war of aggression per se was the international crime from which all other crimes during warfare flowed.
The Allies finally agree on this key point. The tribunal will not allow the Nazis to defend their actions by claiming the Allies have also committed crimes.
They just came up with kind of a blanket rule. We will find it no defense to say, but you did it too. I think that that was, in some ways, again, an expression of just realism. You weren't going to get the Allies ready to try the Russians. The Russians wouldn't participate. At the same time, I do think as a matter of law, this is not an incorrect position. That is, it is no defense to murder to say other people have murdered.
After a month of tough negotiations, Jackson has prevailed. The trial will be conducted on his terms. On July the 7th, 1945, a plane lands in the old southern German city of Nuremberg, which has been severely damaged in Allied air raids. Jackson wants to hold the trials at the scene of the crimes.
He was devastated, totally devastated. The rubble was everywhere. Buildings were down. Those that were standing were gutted. The stench of bodies was in the air, buried under the rubble. However, the Palace of Justice, I think of the land of Franconia, was standing and was relatively undamaged. It was chosen, even though it was in the midst of considerable chaos.
Inside the palace, Jackson and his colleagues from Britain and France walk through dark corridors full of rubble and visit the courtrooms. The largest one is used by GIs as a recreation hall. Justice Jackson is soon convinced the building can be refurbished in time to house trials. And the symbolic value of Nuremberg is compelling. Where it all began, it was to end. Before the war, it is in Nuremberg that the Nazis hold their monstrous party rallies with mass parades. Huge crowds celebrate the Führer and his henchmen. Within a few weeks of coming to power, the Nazis, and Hermann Goering in particular, have already demonstrated their will to safeguard their rule at any cost. As early as February 1933, Goering has issued an order to persecute and execute political opponents.
I shall make a clean sweep and get rid of all those in office who owe their positions solely to their black or red convictions and to the suppression of nationalist tendencies. It is my task to restore Prussia as the main bulwark of the German nation. I will carry it out with all my strength, with ruthless determination and with an iron will.
Overnight, the police had taken on new power that it never had before. And we all were aware that from now on, when the doorbell rang at night, we could not be sure that it was the milkman. It was the milkman or the Gestapo. This we learned, and it was spread around, and before very long, of course, we saw and heard about the development of the concentration camps.
Goering establishes one of the first camps for the corrective treatment of political prisoners near Berlin. Unlike the picture painted by propaganda, the inmates are tortured and murdered. Soon, the Nazis are able to use Goering's newly founded secret state police as an instrument of terror.
Es wurden Leute reihenweise ermordet. Das Wort Gestapo ist eigentlich erst in der zweiten Hälfte des Jahres 1933 gefallen, als
people were murdered by the dozen. The name Gestapo only came up in the second half of 1933, when people were increasingly being picked up by the secret state police for questioning and swept off after religious ceremonies.
Sich die Leute dann versucht haben zu beschweren.
There were complaints, but frequently those who complained were then picked up for questioning. Of course, complaints quickly ceased, whereas the illegal intrusions increased.
Hermann Goering soon becomes one of the most popular personalities in the Third Reich. The population does not seem to begrudge him any of his quirks. In a German newsreel, the affable hedonist who weighs over 300 pounds is even shown with his pet lion. Hitler seems to trust his old companion blindly, and thanks to an expanding net of informers, Goering can supply his Führer with inside information about the government and the party. Goering also has a new woman at his side. Shortly after the death of his first wife, he begins courting the actress Emmy Sonnemann. Emmy Sonnemann is often cast as a conservative German housewife, primarily on stage, but occasionally also in films. In William Tell, for instance, she plays the wife of the Swiss national hero. Goering's first wife was buried in the cemetery of Lorva near Stockholm. At the end of June 1934, Goering has Karin's remains transported to his estate near Berlin. As a heroine of the early Nazi movement, her final resting place shall be in German soil.
Sie bedeutete ihm alles und ihr Tod war für ihn fürchterlich schwer. Damals war es aber schon so, dass zu einer wichtigen Posten.
She had meant everything to him, and her death was a huge blow. But by that time, he held an important position. I know that removing her remains to Germany was seen as a significant event by the German people. Propaganda was important in those days, and for some reason he was more popular than many other National Socialist figures.
Populärer als viele andere nationalsozialistische Führer.
The Führer attends the solemn burial ceremony. In fact, Hitler is seeking a meeting with his confidant, and the state funeral proves useful in planning a large-scale purge. From informer reports, Göring knows how discontented the influential leader of the Nazi stormtroopers really is. Ernst Röhm has openly threatened Hitler and claims more power for the party army. In close coordination with Göring, Hitler decides to eliminate the danger. On June the 30th, 1934, Hitler orders Röhm's arrest and has his old friend executed almost immediately.
Regional Police Squad General Göring marching past the Reich Chancellery on the day the traitors were sentenced. The Führer is cheered by the masses.
At Göring's behest, death squads set out on purging missions in Berlin and all around the country. Throughout Germany, about 200 people are killed. In order to cover his tracks, Göring orders the destruction of all written evidence of the murder mission. Hitler is pleased by Göring's cold-blooded methods for eliminating adversaries. Few people know that in December 1934, Hitler, in a secret personal decree, appoints Göring as his successor. Hermann Göring becomes the unchallenged number 2 in Nazi Germany. He embodies the unity of the party, the state, and the army leadership.
The Führer has bridged the gap, dividing the German people, and thrown into the melting pot of the grand idea all the forces that were straining apart and opposing each other: parties, classes, rank and religion. Today, German military unity is firmly based on the National Socialist ideology.
Since the Nazis have come to power, Göring secretly recreates the German Air Force that was banned after the First World War. At the beginning of 1935, he publicly acknowledges its existence. As Commander-in-Chief of the Air Force, General Göring attains the highest rank of military command in the Third Reich. He becomes one of the driving forces of rearmament. On April the 10th, 1935, a state ceremony is celebrated in Berlin. Hermann Göring leads Emmy Sonnemann to the altar. Even beyond Germany's borders, the wedding causes a stir. Now it's only the throne or the scaffold for him, scoffs the British ambassador. Göring uses millions in taxpayers' money to create a bombastic summer residence on his forest estate, where he frequently receives state guests. Emmy Göring enjoys her role as the First Lady, while her husband plays the last man of the Renaissance for celebrities like SS Chief Heinrich Himmler.
War halt eine Figur, die auch ein bisschen Komik hervorgerufen hat.
He was a figure with definite comic elements. When he posed like Mussolini, bedecked with medals, he was secretly laughed at by the general public. Of course, we didn't laugh because we realized what he really stood for.
Göring shares Hitler's obsessive anti-Semitism, but he has a more pragmatic approach. "I determine who is a Jew," is one of his comments on the state-sanctioned persecution. As president of the Nazi parliament, he officially announces every anti-Semitic law.
Das, was im September 1935 passiert ist, war für mich
What happened in September 1935, for me, will always be inextricably connected with Goering, the proclamation of the Nuremberg laws. I recall his exact tone of voice when he announced it here in Nuremberg's Kulturverein, and we were forced to listen to it on the radio. Only those residents can be citizens of the Reich who are German or of closely related bloodlines, who are willing and suitable to serve the German people and the Reich loyally. Marriage between Jews and Germans, or persons of Aryan blood, is not permissible. The way he proclaimed all this showed how satisfied he was with the new legislation.
The Nuremberg laws become the symbol of Germany's fanatic anti-Semitism. 10 years later, the remaining survivors responsible for war and genocide are to stand trial in the city of Nuremberg. The first group of Nazi defendants is brought to the Nuremberg prison on August 12, 1945. The massive complex behind the Palace of Justice can hold up to 1,200 detainees. Each prisoner is lodged in a separate cell and not permitted to speak except during interrogations. Goering's cell is tiny and barren. Justice Jackson decides to personally confront Goering with the prosecution evidence. No longer addicted to morphine, Goering is fit, focused, lucid, and fiercely unapologetic.
Jackson came down there to meet Goering before he'd meet him in the court. But Goering got as much good or as much knowledge of Jackson out of this as Jackson got from Goering. The relationship was ice cold. There was no warmth. Jackson worked from these documents, and his questions were, did you do this? Did you sign this?
Jackson's concern was that the defendants, and Goering first among them, would use it as a platform to stimulate some resurgence of Nazism in Germany. That this was a virus that was not dead, that the defeat and death of Hitler did not mean forever the end of Nazism, and that Jackson was dealing with a very volatile, dangerous prospect of the Nazi future as he dealt with these defendants.
Justice Jackson knows he's prepared for his enormous task. The American prosecution is ready for the trial. Out of volumes of incriminating documents, Jackson's team has picked the gravest examples of the crimes committed by the defendants. Finally, the indictments are handed down to the former German leaders.
Goering was accused of conspiracy, war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes against the peace, and he was very businesslike. He was not visibly upset. He still radiated this feeling this is nothing but a charade, but a show, a victory of the victors. And the reaction of some of the others was like his, and some of them were shocked. But Goering showed no obvious sign of shock at all.
Hermann Goering makes it clear to Jackson and his team that they will be up against a formidable adversary. Determined to follow a clear defense strategy, he will not repent his deeds.
In bombed-out Nuremberg, preparations go forward for the trials of Germany's major war criminals and the shrine of Hitler's...
Now newsreels bring the unfolding story of the Nuremberg trial to movie screens across the world.
In
Nuremberg's court building, where the trials will be held, German prisoners work at enlarging and rebuilding the courtroom. Under American supervision, they install broadcasting booths and press facilities to carry the proceedings throughout the world. Robert H. Jackson, Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, made preliminary arrangements for the trial. From the jail to the courtroom, a covered corridor has been erected. The war criminals will be screened from sight except in the courtroom, protected and saved for the disposition of United Nations justice. The big names of Hitler's Third Reich are kept under heavy guard.
This is the moment you've been waiting for all these black, despairing years, an American reporter writes. To see justice catch up with evil. This really is the end of the long night, of the hideous nightmare. On November the 20th, 1945, the International Military Tribunal begins its proceedings against the former leaders of the Third Reich.
Attention! Tribunal!
The prosecutors and judges represent the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union.
We all sat there. We knew we were going to hear the opening of the trial, and there was no doubt that this would be something that none of us would forget. Here, they are putting forth for the first time that all of us are responsible for what we do, and we will be judged accordingly. We cannot just punish the little people and let the big ones get away. We must look at everybody and determine whether he is guilty or not.
You look at Nuremberg, and you're looking at the result of war, another journalist comments. You look at the men in the dock, and you're seeing the cause. The International Military Tribunal charges 21 surviving leaders of the Third Reich with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Defendant number one is Hermann Γκέρινγκ, once the most powerful Nazi behind Hitler.
I've always differentiated between Goering's remarkable intelligence and his indifference regarding moral issues. They simply didn't affect him.
Γκέρινγκ and the other defendants reject the tribunal as victor's justice. The American chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, is determined to convict them for their crimes. His cross-examination of Γκέρινγκ will be a duel to the death, predicts one of the judges, between the representative of all that is worthwhile in civilization and the last important surviving protagonist of all that was evil.
The door was open and Γκέρινγκ took it. Γκέρινγκ began to make speeches rather than responding to the question.
Ich persönlich habe alles getan, dass
I personally did what I could to fight for an appropriate position for the Führer as Reich Chancellor.
den ihm gebührenden Platz als Reichskanzler zu erkämpfen.
After you came to power, you regarded it as necessary, in order to maintain power, that you suppress all opposition parties. That is correct.
I deemed it necessary that we cease to permit any opposition, yes.
And you also held it necessary that you should suppress all individual opposition.
In einzelnen Fällen ließ sich Unterlagen geben, ohne dass die Experten genau erkennen konnten, zu welchem Grunde. In anderen Fällen hat seinen Fachberatern gegenüber ausgesprochen, was beabsichtigte, und von ihnen diesbezüglich Unterlagen oder Beurteilungen eingeholt. Entschieden hat als oberster Führer selbst.
Attention! Tribunal!
On November the 21st, 1945, the courtroom in the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg is packed, when the American chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, is called to open the case against the Nazi defendants. Jackson considers this trial the most important act of his life and has been working on his speech for weeks.
Nobody, not a single person, had been able to obtain an advanced copy of what he would say. The people in the translation booth, they had it for the first time. When they heard him speak it, they had to translate it. And let me tell you, it was as if Shakespeare suddenly had been revived and was speaking.
That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
Jackson's speech lasts for hours. The effect on the hundreds gathered in the courtroom is palpable.
Is not the product of abstract speculation.
The eloquence of it, the power of it, was immediate and enormous. The defendants were sort of knocked back in the box and were a very depressed lot as they returned to their lunchroom in the middle of it and to their cells at the end of the day, because this was really their first experience of Jackson in action in the courtroom, and they, in a new way, understood that they were up against it.
My spine throbbed, an American reporter writes, as Jackson used the power of language to build up his masterly case against Nazi barbarism. We have heard today one of the great trial addresses of history. After the dramatic opening, the American prosecution presents its case, based on thousands of documents piled up by the Documentation Division in the Palace of Justice. Out of volumes of incriminating evidence, the prosecutors have picked out the grimmest examples to establish the Nazi conspiracy and proof of the crimes committed by the defendants. Although the evidence is overwhelming, Justice Jackson soon learns that the full reading of the documents will slow down the trial considerably.
Jackson, he's sitting there through it, and the tribunal's requirements about how the documents have to be read before they can be accepted into evidence, the delay caused by the translation system is a kind of numbing that he's experiencing too. He's not the first to propose it, but he's quickly persuaded that other types of evidence, particularly film evidence, should be played sooner rather than later as a way of dramatizing and pumping up the proceedings a little bit.
In the courtroom, a 4-hour-long film is shown called The Nazi Plan. It portrays the defendants at the height of their power, conducting wars of aggression. The footage taken from confiscated German propaganda films is supposed to prove how the Nazis, systematically violating treaties, rearmed Germany and attacked their neighboring countries with the criminal intent of subjugating and pillaging them. When the lights come up in the courtroom, Goering is ecstatic. The film has been so rousing, he boasts, that Prosecutor Jackson will now surely want to join the National Socialist Party. Back in his cell, Goering is even more candid. "I could save the prosecution a lot of trouble," he declares. "They don't have to show films and read documents to prove that we rearmed for war. Of course we rearmed. Why, I rearmed Germany until we bristled. I'm only sorry we didn't rearm even more. Of course I considered your treaties as nothing more than toilet paper. Of course we wanted to make Germany great. If it could be done peacefully, all well and good. If not, that was fine too." With the pictures from the heyday of his power in mind, Goering now seems to really enjoy the proceedings. In the mid-1930s, Goering is a state within the state. As Adolf Hitler's commissioner for the four-year plan, he has wide-ranging authorities to set the agenda for the rearmament of the Third Reich.
Hermann Göring war bei großen Teil der Bevölkerung beliebt.
Hermann Goering was a widely popular figure. His popularity differed from that of Hitler, who was virtually idolized. But people had a soft spot for the fat guy with all his medals. I think it's a question of identification. Nobody could identify with Hitler, that was impossible. People just didn't dare to.
Hitler hat man sich nicht identifiziert, konnte man sich nicht, hat man sich nicht getraut.
He's the best man I have, Hitler praises his faithful companion. A man with determination, who knows what has to be done and carries it out. As Commander-in-Chief of the Nazi Air Force, Goering consolidates his claim to power with a prestigious ministerial building in Berlin. From here, he administrates the massive armament of Germany without any regard for the economy's ability to cope. We must not allow ourselves to calculate the cost, he says. When we triumph, the economy will be amply compensated. Germany's war machine needs to be ready soon. On November the 5th, 1937, during a secret conference with his military leaders, Hitler has disclosed that the use of force would soon be imperative.
It was obvious that this would lead to war. There was no question war was in the air. There was a degree of planes flying over us, artillery pieces dragging through the streets, barracks being built, soldiers everywhere. And there was no question that war was coming.
The expansion of the Third Reich shall also open up new capital resources, since it is rapidly becoming a huge strain to finance the country's armament. On his estate near Berlin, Goering goes hunting with foreign diplomats, while reassuring them that Nazi Germany's intentions are entirely peaceful. His guests are happy to believe his supposedly moderate line. While Hitler wants war, Goering favors the extortion potential of German power politics. In March 1938, however, the Führer appears to be the one who hesitates, while Goering is the driving force. With unconcealed threats, he forces the resignation of the Austrian government and persuades Hitler to order his troops to invade the neighboring country. A few days later, the two men are hailed in Berlin by enthusiastic crowds. Although his influence on Hitler's foreign policy soon fades, Goering maintains his prominent position in the National Socialist Society. Hitler becomes even the godfather of Goering's daughter, Edda. A few days later, on the night of November the 9th, 1938, synagogues are torched all over Germany. More than 8,000 Jewish businesses are destroyed, and at least 91 Jews killed by the raging mobs.
There were fire engines all over, and there was the burning synagogue. I saw that every one of the Jewish stores, the windows had been blasted and people were looting, and I saw SR men running around beating up a few Jews, and it was a horrible sight. But I did not have the courage to speak up for them.
On Hitler's instructions, Goering is in charge of the solution of the Jewish question. and immediately takes action against the victims. The insurance companies are ordered not to pay compensation for the damage, and a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks is imposed on the Jewish community.
Goering more or less said, "I wish you'd killed a few more Jews and hadn't caused so much material damage." In all those years, Goering was one of the main instigators of Jewish persecution. He also said the famous words, "I determine who is a Jew."
When the German army invades Poland on September the 1st, 1939, Goering stands staunchly by his Führer's side. Hitler rewards his loyalty by publicly confirming a secret succession arrangement.
"Should anything happen to me during the battle, my first successor is to be fellow party member Goering."
The German Air Force was not deemed ready for combat. However, in the war against Poland, it proves vastly superior to the enemy's forces. Goering pompously announces further victories.
"Our Air Force showed promise in Poland, and it will keep those promises in England and France." In other words, the enemy will be targeted, beaten and destroyed there too.
The German army occupies Denmark and Norway in the spring of 1940. Belgium and the Netherlands are invaded soon after. France is forced to surrender. Only Britain continues to defy the Nazi aggression. Hitler awards Goering the unique title of Reichsmarschall, Marshal of Nazi Germany, the highest military rank possible. The Führer's favorite architect, Albert Speer, agrees to plan an official office building with the largest staircase in the world. Goering promises to send prisoners of war to work as slave laborers on the construction site. Although he's not in favor of Hitler's plan to invade the Soviet Union, he expects valuable resources for the war economy from occupied territories. As the war against the Soviet Union begins in June 1941, the systematic annihilation of European Jews commences too. On July the 31st, 1941, Goering signs a decree authorizing an overall plan for the desired solution to the Jewish question. 6 months later, logistical issues concerning the final solution are discussed in the villa at the Weg in Berlin. Whether Goering knows of the elaborate genocide remains unproved. As his deputy is present at the conference, very likely. And propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels later reminds Goering of the consequences should the war be lost. Particularly in the Jewish question, we are so committed that there is no way out for us. The whole truth about the Holocaust is brought to light during the Nuremberg Tribunal. Hitler and Goebbels have evaded responsibility by committing suicide. Jackson's team now submits striking evidence to prove the complicity of the surviving Nazi leaders that are accused of crimes against humanity. On November the 29th, 1945, further film evidence is presented in the courtroom, documenting heinous Nazi atrocities in the concentration camps.
It was impossible to remain unaffected by it. It was almost unbearable. And to sit opposite these men whose faces were illuminated from below while the film was being shown. There were various reactions by the defendants. Some pointed away, as did Hermann Goering. I think he even removed the set to avoid hearing the transmission. Others looked at cases and passion, though were to a certain extent affected by war. In any case, there were scenes that showed horrendous events. Of course, the question arose whether it was possible that those at the top hadn't known about this. I turned around and asked Goering, Dönitz and Hess, did really no one know about this? And Goering remarked, well, you know, those at the top are always the last to know.
Witnesses now describe details of the genocide. In Goering's order for the final solution, SS officer Dieter Wilslicheny helped to organize the deportation of Jews to extermination camps.
What became of the Jews to whom you've already referred, the approximately 250,000, 450,000?
They were all brought to Auschwitz and became part of the final solution.
Do you mean they were killed?
Yes, except about 25 to 30% that were used for labor purposes.
Goering is infuriated that his countrymen testify against him. It is sickening to see how Germans sell their souls to the enemy, he rages.
His reactions to all the main witnesses were unmistakable. He practically seethed and would occasionally remark something like scoundrels. He actually spoke to some of them after they had testified.
Goering's disruptive behavior in the courtroom leads to new regulations. Since the beginning of the trial, the lunch break is the only time the defendants are able to talk. Goering has used the opportunity to impose his desire for a united front on the others. Finally, he is separated. Goering has lost his audience. He is frustrated and angry. On March the 13th, 1946, Hermann Goering takes the stand in his own defense. He testifies that all his actions served the best interests of Germany. For 5 days, he holds the courtroom in thrall.
Ich persönlich kann ja nur für mich sprechen, habe alles getan.
I personally, and I can only speak for myself, did everything that lay within my power to strengthen and enhance the National Socialist movement. And I worked relentlessly to bring it to power, meaning absolute and unlimited power.
Jackson is not very worried about carrying his burden of proof on the crimes charged. He doesn't need confessions from Hermann Goering. They have an extensive documentary record, including many things Goering had signed. But Jackson's very concerned about not letting Goering turn this examination into a platform from which he'll be able to rally the German people to a renewed enthusiasm for Nazism.
The American chief prosecutor knows that he needs to regain control. The Palace of Justice is jam-packed when, on March the 18th, Robert Jackson begins his cross-examination. The cross-examination had not proceeded more than 10 minutes, one of the judge's notes, before it was seen that Goering was the complete master of Mr. Justice Jackson.
I don't understand it very well, and I want to get what's necessary to run the kind of a system that you set up in Germany. And concentration camps was one of the things you found immediately necessary upon coming to power, is it not? Was it not? And you set them up as a matter of necessity, as you saw it.
Goering quickly saw the elements of the situation, the same judge observes, and as his confidence grew, his mastery became more apparent.
You asked me if I considered it necessary to establish concentration camps immediately in order to eliminate opposition. That is correct.
As Jackson pressed him, Goering saw what was going on, and he became very wordy and evasive. And his answers were long explanation, and he would say, well, you do the same thing in the United States and Great Britain and so forth. There's no difference, and so on.
All of these things were necessary things, as I understood you, to protect...
Yes, these things were necessary because of the opponents that existed.
Yes. And I assume that that is the only kind of government that you think can function in Germany under present conditions?
Under the conditions existing at the time, it was, in my opinion, the only possible form. And it also demonstrated that Germany could be raised in a short time from the depths of misery, poverty and unemployment to relative prosperity.
The press, like Jackson himself, had a sort of prize fight mentality about the event that they were watching, and they expected another knockout, a crushing blow and a collapse, a confession, something of that dramatic order. Instead, what they saw was a great lawyer running into a great, powerful, brilliant witness, and a combative examination that was something of a draw whenever they tried to talk about the great topics and the ultimate questions.
If you'll just answer my questions, we'll save a great deal of time. You did prohibit all court review and considered it necessary to prohibit court review of the causes for taking people into what you call protective custody. That is right, isn't it?
That I answered very clearly, but I should like to make an explanation in connection with my answer.
Justice Jackson then sought the help of Chief Justice Lawrence in restricting Γκέρινγκ to making the direct answers to Jackson's question.
The difficulty is that the tribunal loses control of these proceedings if the defendant, in a case of this kind, where we all know propaganda is one of the purposes of the defendants, is permitted to put his propaganda in, and then we have to meet it afterwards.
Unfortunately, as it happened, Lord Lawrence, who was the chief judge, sensitive to history itself, elected to allow Γκέρινγκ pretty much unlimited freedom in his responses.
Goering obviously enjoyed himself as he kept the courtroom spellbound, one reporter comments. The first day of cross-examination ends triumphantly for Goering. He has answered the chief prosecutor's questions calmly and directly, and the tribunal has allowed him to launch into several self-serving orations. But as the second and third days of cross-examination unfold, Jackson gradually gains the upper hand.
Da waren so seine Gehilfen vorgefahren mit Stapeln von Dokumenten.
His aides presented piles of documents, almost all of them signed by him. And the still rather arrogant Nazi leader gradually seemed to visibly shrink as all his bogus objections were demolished.
Point by point, Jackson lists Goering's crimes and verifies everything with incriminating evidence. The verbal battle has taken a turn.
When we got Γκέρινγκ into the matter of the specific crimes that he committed, such as the persecution of the Jews, well, then he collapsed. He was a done witness, I'll tell you, because we had him so devastated on the Jewish issue that he had nothing to say.
You, Hermann Γκέρινγκ, published a decree imposing a fine of 1 billion marks for atonement on all Jews.
I have already explained that all these decrees at that time were signed by me, and I assume responsibility for them.
It was you, was it not, who signed a decree to make the plans for the complete solution of the Jewish question. Now that document is signed by you, is it not?
That is correct.
Goering then leaves the stand, not the next Fuhrer, which had been Jackson's fear, and he leaves the stand convicted by his own admissions, which was Jackson's immediate objective. So with a sort of sober endpoint assessment, an observer, I think, could understand this had not been a good day or a good series of days for Goering. The press from the time focused a lot more on the first hour than on the full multiple-day examination.
Jackson, a judge observes, looks beaten and dead tired. The prosecutor himself is so concerned about his performance that for a moment he considers resigning. Goering's defense has lasted for 2 weeks. He was anxious, writes one journalist, whatever his fate, that history record him as an important world figure and as a German hero. Goering himself is in a good mood and expects applause for his performance. "Well, I didn't cut a petty figure, did I?" he asks, as brought back to the prison block. "I had the best legal means against me, ads, a whole legal machinery, and there I was, alone."
There's a good deal of it in the press that Goering had gotten the best of my father. Proof of the pudding is in the tribunal's decision, because despite this difficulty, my father did obtain many damning admissions from Goering, which formed the basis of his conviction and of the penalty which the tribunal handed down.
A fellow defendant in the prison comments, "Strange, should have seen him in earlier days. A lazy, corrupt, responsible morph." Indeed, Goering was in such visible decline during the war that it is a surprise to many to see him perform in the Nuremberg courtroom. Amateur commander of the Air Force during a visit no longer believes that victory is possible. He despises the war, a nuisance. His lethargy is obvious, even beyond.
Goering hörte lautlos zu.
Goethe listened in silence, then in the room only to return 10 minutes later, brighter. It was miraculous that he was on drugs.
A reception in honor of Goering's 50th birthday in January 19. At this point, hundreds of thousands of German troops in Stalingrad. Against his better judgment, Goering assures Hitler that the isolate can be supplied by air. Again, he has managed to impress the Führer with empty promises. As often as he can, Goering retires to Marienhall, his increasingly pompous residence outside Berlin, which he has constantly expanded and furnished with stolen art from all over Europe. Only here does he seem to be able to forget reality. A huge concrete bunker houses the command center for the air defense of Berlin. It is here that the reason for Goering's decline lays: the failure of his air force in the war against Allied bombers. Goering tries to mollify his Führer with increasingly far-fetched and pretentious promises, which naturally cannot be kept. Joseph Goebbels notes in his diary that Goering's prestige with the Führer is irrevocably damaged, as he simply isn't up to the job. Goering fires close aides if they dare to criticize him. If an air raid is misjudged, Goering forgets that he has personally approved the defense plans.
Goering hatte alle Minuten angerufen und sich erkundigt für die Feindlage und die Beurteilung.
He called every minute. I had a direct line to Goering, a special phone. I had it painted the same colors as his uniform, elephant gray with gold braids and a white bell. And when it lit up, everyone knew, quiet everyone, Falk is talking to the old man, or vice versa. I remember Goering saying in one particular case, even his washerwoman would have known better, and he didn't need any staff officers, and I'd been stupid enough to concentrate all our troops around Berlin.
When Goering appears in public, people call him names. More and more jokes are told about him, but he has kept a sense of humor. In spite of everything, Goering is still popular. Although he is the commander of the German Air Force, he now avoids Hitler.
Der Göring war im Grunde genommen auch schon fast eine Randfigur bei diesen Lagerbesprechungen. Göring erschien auch also nur sporadisch.
Basically, he was only a minor figure at the situation discussions. Göring would sporadically put in a bombastic appearance. He was a grotesque sight when he turned up in a white uniform in the depth of winter, wearing amazing mauve Morocco boots with the tops reaching up to his enormously fat thighs.
Die Stulpen bis also hoch auf den Oberschenkel.
It really was a ludicrous spectacle.
Dann da absprangen. Also das war schon eine groteske Erscheinung.
Still, Hitler does not have the nerve to depose his popular companion until the very end. He dreads the devastating effect on the nation. After all, Göring is still his designated successor. As more and more German cities go up in flames, Göring is hunting for Easter eggs with his little daughter Edda. His aides feel that Göring is completely out of his depth.
Da waren wir nach Berchtesgaden befohlen worden. General Stumpf und ich.
Colonel General Stumpf and I had been ordered to Berchtesgaden. Stumpf was reporting on the situation of air defense. I almost felt sorry for Göring. He had an exercise book and was making notes. He was like a schoolboy, taking remedial lessons. I felt really sorry for him. He was obviously trying to catch up with reality, but it was too late.
Evidently, Göring entertains hopes that he will be able to negotiate a separate peace agreement with the Western Allies. On April the 23rd, 1945, he sends a telegram from Bavaria to Hitler in his bunker in Berlin.
Er hat das dann so gefasst in dem Telegramm. Hitler wäre ja nun nicht mehr voll funktionsfähig.
The way he put it in the telegram was that, as Hitler was unable to operate as head of the Reich, he suggested that the executive power should be transferred to him by 10 p.m. that evening, unless Hitler gave orders to the contrary.
Reaktion von Hitler, das also als eine Unverschämtheit ansah.
Hitler was furious at this impudence and typically reacted with utmost severity. He ordered Göring to be stripped of all his positions.
Hitler orders that in case of his own death, the traitor shall be executed along with his wife and daughter. In order to ensure the safety of their prisoners, the guards remove them to a remote castle in Austria. This is where Hermann Göring spends the last days of the Third Reich. When Göring falls into the hands of American troops, he expects the Allies to accept him as a negotiator. Only after they place him in confinement does he realize that he will be a principal defendant in a large-scale trial of the victors. His reported comment is, "At least I lived well for 12 years. After Göring's duel with Justice Jackson has ended, the other Nazi leaders testify in the Nuremberg courtroom in their own defense. Most of them claim they have merely been following orders. A few admit responsibility for crimes. Then, on July the 25th, 1946, Robert Jackson delivers his long-anticipated closing statement.
Mr. President and members of the tribunal, it is impossible, in summation, to do more than outline with bold strokes the vitals of this trial's mad and melancholy record, which will live as the historical text of the 20th century's shame and depravity. It is against such a background that these defendants now ask this tribunal to say that they are not guilty of planning, executing, or conspiring to commit this long list of crimes and wrongs. They stand before the record of this tribunal as blood-stained Gloucester stood by the body of his slain king. He begged of the widow, as they beg of you, "Say I slew them not." And the Queen replied, "Then say they were not slain, but dead they are." If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, that there are no slain, that there has been no crime.
On September the 2nd, after 216 days in court, the International Tribunal retires to deliberate the fate of the accused. Hermann Göring declares in resignation that once the Germans find out all that has been exposed in the trial, one will not have to worry about the emergence of legends about Hitler. But the world awaits justice.
At the Hall of Justice in Nuremberg, history's greatest trial nears its fateful close. Under the most elaborate security precautions, only official cars pass the heavily guarded street barricade. Supreme Court Justice Jackson, Chief United States Prosecutor, arrives. Defense counsel wait with ill-concealed anxiety for the verdict in a trial conducted with scrupulous fairness for the rights of the defendants. Literally tons of paper were removed after each long, drawn-out session of court. For 5 savage and bloody years, humanity has waited for this moment of retribution.
For 4 weeks, the court deliberates on the guilt or innocence of the defendants. In Hermann Göring's case, the 8 judges quickly agree. He has prepared wars of aggression, ordered war crimes, and was involved in crimes against humanity and genocide. October the 1st, 1946 is pronounced Judgment Day. For the last time, the defendants walk from the prison to the courthouse. The elevator takes them directly to the courtroom.
The door would open for one defendant at a time, and he would take position in front. Hermann Göring came first.
The courtroom is as packed as it was on the opening day. The audience eagerly awaits the pronouncement of the verdicts. All eyes are focused on Hermann Göring.
Göring was unable to respond to Lord Lawrence, and he said something's wrong with these headphones. So there was an awkward delay while they removed the headphones from Göring and got another set of headphones and gave it to him. So then Göring stood up and Lord Lawrence read the sentence.
Angeklagter Göring, das Gericht verurteilt Sie zum Tode durch den Strang. Sentenced to death by hanging.
Defendant Hermann Wilhelm Göring, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal sentences you to death by hanging.
Göring and 10 others are sentenced to death. 7 defendants receive prison sentences. 3 are acquitted.
Da hatte man eben doch den Eindruck, dass man an einem Verfahren teilnimmt.
One was left with the impression of having witnessed proceedings where the entire weight of a lost war and the weight of committed crimes was concentrated on just a few people.
Einige wenige Menschen sich konzentrieren.
On death row in the Nuremberg prison, a time of waiting begins. After an Allied Control Commission confirms the verdicts and rejects all pleas for clemency, the Nazi leaders know that the time has come to prepare themselves for execution. Hermann Göring would have accepted an execution by firing squad as befitting his rank. They will not hang me, he vows. Göring's wife and daughter are allowed final visits. Emmy Göring believes that they will never hang her husband, but intern him on an island, like Napoleon. The executions are to commence after midnight on October the 16th, 1946. 3 gallows have been erected. The prisoners eat their last meal. Just as every other night, the cells of the death row prisoners are floodlit and continuously monitored. At 10:45 p.m., 2 hours before Göring is to hang, a guard sees him put an arm to his face and begin to choke. Göring has managed to get hold of a capsule of potassium cyanide. Within a few minutes, the Nazi warlord is dead. I decided to take my own life, Göring confides in a farewell letter to his wife, lest I be executed in so terrible a fashion by my enemies. His body is secretly taken to Munich and cremated, his ashes scattered in a local river. Despite criticism of Victor's justice, the Nuremberg trial has created a new form of justice, which has since been confirmed by the United Nations and the European Court of Human Rights. At the time, reviews of Robert Jackson's performance and of the tribunal itself are mixed. But over time, the Nuremberg trial is seen as a milestone in history.
I think probably the major contribution of the International Military Tribunal was to declare once and for all war as an international crime. It's the war, it's the aggressive war that lies behind these other crimes that we proved against the Nuremberg defendants.
Justice Jackson himself is not under the illusion that Nuremberg will prevent future leaders from engaging in war because they fear prosecution. Nevertheless, it is a hope.
When you talk about mass atrocity, mass violence, it will always be a small fraction of those who could be found responsible, and yet it is better to go ahead with that than to do nothing. I do believe that the Nuremberg trials represent not only a rejection of vengeance and summary execution, but also a rejection of doing nothing.
Nuremberg has established an important precedent. If the hand of vengeance is stayed, justice can prevail over evil.